Bruckner at the Turning Point: The Earliest Recordings of the Fourth Symphony as Documents of Changing Interpretive Practices. Benjamin Korstvedt, Clark University. Current views of the music of Anton Bruckner still bear the deep impression of a revolution in the understanding of his works that occurred in the 1930s. It was then that the image of Bruckner as a naive, unworldly composer, victimized by the urbane society of Vienna, was cemented, as was the idea that Bruckner was a composer of solidly traditional, even classical symphonies, and hardly the dangerous modernist that many saw in him in the 1880s and 1890s. Even more influential, and in many ways more radical, was the appearance in the 1930s and 1940s of the first modern collected edition of Bruckner's works, which effectively reshaped the canon of his symphonies and revolutionized the understanding of the textual issues involved with them. The new edition and the publicity surrounding it generated intense concern about the existence of multiple versions of some of the symphonies, and excited debate about the authenticity or lack thereof of different versions and editions. These are issues that have remained at the center of Bruckner's scholarship and interpretation ever since. The Bruckner Revolution of the 1930s had direct and durable ramifications for the performance of the symphonies as well. The new editions that were produced at the time were presented as the recovery of the long-lost original intentions of the composer, and this, in the rhetoric of those times, freed his works from all falsifications and from anything impure. To this end, the editors relied solely on Bruckner's autographed manuscripts and categorically rejected the available printed editions of the scores, even those published with the composer's approval, for they regarded these as inadmissibly compromised, if not corrupted, by editorial interventions. The logic behind this decision was fraught and has been brought into serious question by scholarship and research over the last generation. But the successful promulgation of this view at that time meant that performances of Bruckner's symphonies were increasingly based on these new editions, and they largely remain so to this day. Musically, aside from changes in formal structure found in a few movements, the defining characteristics of these new editions is the relative absence of many of the performance-related notations found in the scores published in the 1880s and 1890s, which had been in use before the 1930s. Indications for tempo fluctuations, crescendi, decrescendi, diminuendi, and the like are notably less frequent and less consistently applied in the so-called original editions, and naturally this had direct influence on performance practices. The new original edition of the Fourth, to take one example, is in some passages far more sparing of such markings, as can be seen in this example. The general trend toward more objective performance styles of classical works existed widely during the mid-20th century, as is well known. In the case of Bruckner, this tendency was fueled additionally, at least in the long run, by the adoption of these new original editions. The conception, production, dissemination, and initial performances of these new Bruckner editions took place in an extraordinary and compromising socio-political context, namely Nazi Germany, which, after 1938, also encompassed Bruckner's home of Austria. Bruckner and his music were the objects of great politicization at this time. He was treated as a symbol of the so-called community of destiny that supposedly united Germany and Austria. As one recent observer put it, Bruckner was annexed by the Nazi movement. Untangling the ways in which political and particularly ideological factors shape the editing and performance of Bruckner's works is certainly a delicate and multifaceted task. What I'm interested in today is one particular facet of this larger discussion. I want to consider what the earliest recordings of Bruckner's symphonies may or may not be able to say about how performances of this music changed at that time as these new editions were coming into use. Recording a Bruckner symphony posed daunting challenges in the 1920s and 1930s. Unsurprisingly, the number of recordings that were made before the mid-1930s was small. Initially, the Seventh Symphony was the most popular choice of the recording companies. My current project, however, concerns recordings of the Fourth Symphony. This symphony did not appear on records until 1936. As you can see, a number of recordings of this symphony are preserved from that decade and from the next. These provide the basis for some fascinating comparisons. Moreover, the Fourth Symphony serves as a fascinating test case for the interaction of musical text and performance styles, because a new edition of the so-called original version was published in 1936 and quickly began to be performed. It's noteworthy that both of the early commercial recordings, conducted by Karl Böhm and Eugen Joachim, respectively, used this new edition, a choice that, as one propagandistic writer argued at the time, should be obligatory for any purpose that hoped to be regarded as exemplary for others in Nazi Germany. One more piece of the puzzle involves written comments by leading Bruckner conductors. A collection of these appeared in a booklet called Anton Bruckner, Wissenschaftliche und künstlerische Betrachtungen zu den Originalfassungen, or Scholarly and Artistic Observations of the Original Versions. It was produced under the auspices of the International Bruckner Society in 1937, shortly before it was reformed as the German Bruckner Society. Some of these comments offer little more than banal declarations of allegiance to the new editions, as in Franz Konvichny's statement that, "From now and for all eternity there is only one Bruckner, the pure, unfalsified original." Others delved more deeply into musical issues, often in ways that may be unintentionally revealing. Zygmunt von Hausager praised the new editions for their, quote, much more powerful and severe character, as did Eugen Joachim for their incomparably stronger monumentality, clarity, and simplicity. Oswald Kabasta lauded the new edition for sounding much sterner and more uncompromising. Comments in this booklet consistently emphasize the greater strength and power of the new editions, as opposed to the weakness or even hints of effeminacy that haunted the older editions. Johannes Roeder summed up these attitudes quite bluntly. He wrote, "Today, Bruckner no longer needs any tonal effeminacy. We have gradually reached the point where we can be seized by his austerity." This statement seems to articulate a clear expression of what we might see as a fascistic aesthetic of masculine strength, fateful resolve. It seems furthermore as if the relative strength or weakness of an edition was quite directly related to its tempo markings. Karl Böhm wrote that he appreciated that the original version of the Fourth purged the music of infinite arbitrary changes in performance designations, particularly indications for rubato and tempo inflections. One might expect that the new, cleaner texts that were published at that time would lead to stronger, more powerful, and thus, it would seem, somehow less compromised performances of this symphony. What I plan to do, and I should emphasize that my work on this is still in a nascent stage, is to survey these recordings to find meaningful patterns that may emerge, particularly as regards tempo and tempo modifications. Some commentators have recently suggested that there was possibly a Nazi style of Bruckner performance. Already, however, it is becoming clear that what conductors say and what they do are often quite incompatible, and that factors other than the written musical text played decisive roles. Exactly what those factors may have been and how recordings from this time may give us clues about them is very much an open question. During this presentation, I only have a brief time for some music examples. I have selected recordings of three performances of one eventful passage from the middle of the first movement of the Fourth. Perhaps it's best to let these three performances speak for themselves. This initial comparison does not produce a clear picture of the sort suggested by the words of these conductors, to say nothing of the expectations some may have about what a powerful, uncompromising performance of severe monumentality would sound like. In fact, the differences between them are most striking. The most important area of difference, and the one I wish to focus on, involves tempo. The choice of a basic tempo and deviations from it during the course of a piece are, of course, the most basic interpretive decisions a conductor makes, and they bear decisively on the effect of a performance. These three recordings differ significantly in this regard. This slide offers something of a visual representation of the time of each of these three excerpts. And this slide offers a more analytic representation of the tempo fluctuations in each of them. The first of these recordings, which must have been one of the first radio broadcasts of the new so-called original version of the Fourth Symphony, was led by a man who was not only a member of the Nazi Party, but who was entrusted with a number of politically significant performances during that time. And it is in many ways the least unusual of these three performances to current day ears. Its overall duration of nearly 20 minutes is similar to most performances today, and its distinct steadiness of tempo is also strikingly modern. This is certainly so in comparison with the performance led by Bruno Walter in 1940, which is both noticeably quicker in pace and much more fluid in pacing, accelerating and decelerating according to the mood and gesture of this music. Wilhelm Sienkiewicz, a leading Viennese music critic, recently described Walter's performance as, quote, a veritable musical earthquake, wild and impetuous. I should add that although Walter was using the old, supposedly corrupt edition, this does not account for these differences in tempo. In fact, neither edition has any tempo markings in this passage whatsoever. A reading of the contrast between these two performances might seem to fall out neatly along socio-political lines. The approved Nazi performance using the pure edition is severe and massive, in contrast to the wild, impetuous performance given by the Jewish expatriate in New York using a tainted score. But not only is this a crudely simplistic interpretation, but it is belied by the third performance, the one led by Kabasta in 1943. Kabasta was, by all accounts, a convinced adherent of the Nazi movement, and he used the new original edition of the Fourth in this performance, yet his performance exceeds even Walter's in its volatility. Indeed, his performance as a whole, which can be found on YouTube by the curious, is almost shocking by current standards in its fiery accelerandi and highly dramatic shaping of musical episodes. These are hardly attributes that seem to represent a sternly monumental conception of the sort advocated for in public statements by conductors in that era. There is no doubt, however, that in the second half of the 20th century, Bruckner performances became and have remained consistently more massive and sterner than they were in previous decades. As this preliminary report suggests, the factors that contributed to this were complex and multifaceted. They involved a broad sea change in orchestral performance practices, an increasingly pervasive or text mentality, the impact of recordings on musical conceptions, and perhaps deeper sociocultural factors as well. In the case of Bruckner, the predominance of original versions, which, as noted previously, contained far fewer indications related to tempo modifications, also played a uniquely central role. In this way, certainly, the revolution in the understanding of Bruckner's works that occurred in the 1930s has left a deep impression on the ways in which his symphonies are heard today. Thank you.